So a recipe from today's community hub day from Nicholas Allan.
Okay.
So we have the olive bread, focaccia, is that right?
Focaccia bread
and
sourdough bread.
Yeah.
And the principle of all bread dough, whether it's yeast or sourdough, is pretty much the same. Whether you're doing flat bread, sweet breads, if you can get this principle, then you can do any breads, which is that flour is 100%, so whether it's 1 kilo or 7 kilos, and then salt is 2%. You can go marginally less or marginally more, but not with more than 0.5%, so between 1 and 2% max. Liquid, as in water or milk, if it's for croissants, is 70%, and then yeast is between 2 and 10%. So for sourdough, you'd use 10%. So when I made the sourdough bread for focaccia, I mixed herbs, chopped herbs and sun-dried tomatoes and olives into the flour. It's much easier to mix that into the dry flour, than it is into the dough. And then I added the salt, because that's the dry ingredients. You always mix your dry ingredients first, and that's very common for all recipes in baking. And then I added the sourdough starter, or mother as I call it, which is just flour and water that's fermented. I've got one that's over 12 years old, probably more like 20. Every time I use it, I just add a cup of flour and a cup of water, whisk it together and put it back in the fridge to keep it. And if it becomes a bit slow, the bubbles are less, I might add a peeling of apple to revive it for a few days. But otherwise, I just pour in about 10%, which is 2 or 3 cupfuls, to a big bowl of flour. And I've got my 2% salt in, and then I add lukewarm water and mix it with a spoon. I'd prefer to use a spoon in the initial stage until I've got a thick dough that's just about mixed into one mass, but there's still a few loose bits on the bottom. And then I tip it onto my surface, and for this a dough scraper is a great tool. If there's any tool you need for baking, it's a little plastic dough scraper or any flat spatula-like implement. And then you start kneading. The most important thing with kneading is that you break the mass of the dough. You sort of tear it and knead it for about 100 kneads, turning it. I'm right-handed, so I tend to break the dough with my right hand and then turn it with my left. So you've got a sort of circular tearing motion going on until you've got a lovely round mass of dough that's elastic to the touch but isn't solid. And if it sticks, you just throw a dusting of flour underneath the dough. So sometimes it will stick to your hands, and then you just rub your hands with flour and break off the flour and knead it back into the dough. And then you leave it in a tub for about 6 to 8 hours. If you're leaving it for 24 hours, it needs to be in the fridge. This is for sourdough. And then you shape it in maybe 800 gram balls, which again need to be kneaded and rounded and left, and then we rolled them out into round tins and left them to rise for 5 hours, and that created the focaccia dough. Focaccia dough, as you know, needs lots of holes put into it, sprinkled with, I think it's called salamica, which is a mixture of salt, warm water and olive oil. You brush liberally over the top of your focaccia, having put your holes into it, and then it's sprinkled with some rosemary sprigs if you want, fresh rosemary, or a bit more herbs, or sun-dried tomato even, or olives. It's entirely up to you. And then you leave it to rise for another hour, and then bake it at fairly high heat, gas mark 5 on a commercial oven. I don't know what that would be. It's about 210 for 35 minutes, not perhaps even less, until it's golden brown on top. Take it out, let it cool before you cut it. It's very important that bread's left to cool, and then enjoy eating it.
Thank you, Nick.